All starts in the early 1900s with my great-grandparents. They were destined for success. My great-grandmother was to be a teacher at a local school. My great-grandfather, he was a scholar, a university graduate, and headmaster of the most prestigious school in all of Ukraine. Things were starting to look really good for them. But unfortunately, around 1930s, things took a very unfortunate turn for the worst. Stalin rose to power in Soviet Russia, Hitler rose to power in Nazi Germany, and the two forces were destined to collide. Unfortunately, an escape plan had to be made. My great-grandfather was drafted into the Red Army, and he knew that in order to survive, my great-grandmother had to run for the forests and hide there away from any occupation forces. He fought, he served, but unfortunately was captured as prisoner of war, and it was no good time either. Sent to the concentration camps where his fate was soon to be sealed. My great-grandmother was running. She ran from a very small city called Tomashpil to Kiev for 6 months by horse and buggy. By the time she got there, the Nazis already occupied the city, so she had to turn back to her hometown, which was no longer her hometown anymore. It was turned into a concentration camp. She walked into the trap. Unfortunately, this story almost has a bad ending. But by divine miracle, things changed for the better. But despite all of the hardships that can be endured, there was one driving force, that there needed to be a better life for the future. And it was at that moment in time my great-grandfather was in the next batch of prisoner of wars who were bound to be sent to the gas chambers. The gas chamber broke. And they knew that they had to make the run for it and either do or die trying. And they ran a whole squad of them. Many of them got shot down running. But they came to the fence, they came to the wall, and it was by, again, miracle that the Red Army came in with tanks and liberated at that very moment in time. Uniquely, nobody ever believed in the Red Army that anyone could have survived the concentration camps for so long. It's impossible for a former Red Army soldier to have survived. He must have been a double agent. So even the Soviets didn't believe him, and they sent him to a Siberia camp, mining for uranium for nuclear weapons. After several years, interestingly, they were reunited. And they knew at that time that they must do everything they can to make for a better future. They were driven to succeed. By 1950s, 1960s, in the US, when we were having our civil rights movement, and things were starting to progress for the better, in Soviet Russia, things were actually turning out for the worst. There was persecution of many people of my faith on a daily basis. There was no way to advance, there was no way to succeed. But somehow my grandparents, their children, strived for a better future. My grandmother became a doctor. My grandfather, after fighting in the war, became a lawyer, and they had to do everything they possibly can to make for a better future for their children, my parents. And by 1970s, as the turn of the 70s came around, Russia was soon to be bound by another war. It was the Russian-Afghanistan war. Now, many people may not have been fully in depth and realized the gravity of the situation here. But over there, all of the friends of my parents were coming back home in coffins. And they knew that this was a war that just cannot be fought or be won, and it wasn't even worth it. So my grandparents took my parents as they were teens and made the ultimate move to completely forget everything they ever learned. The prestige of being a doctor and a lawyer in Russia completely annihilated, to move to US to strive for a better future. They had to make that ultimate decision. There was no easy mental barrier to overcome, but they knew that they needed to do that to strive for a better future, because they too were driven to succeed. By the 80s, 90s came around, my parents, they met up here, got married. Life was seeming to become very good. They didn't have the opportunity of growing up in America like many of us Americans. In fact, they came to America when high school was already over. They didn't know a lick of English, so going to college was pointless. They just had to make it and try to survive. So after several failed attempts, they decided to open up a mom and pop pizzeria shop. Family business that many of you may know me by. 30 years running. We know, being in the food industry, that sole proprietorship, especially in restaurant ownership, is truly one of the hardest businesses one can ever be in. Demanding customers, the margins, you name it, it's very chaotic. But they knew that there was no other opportunity. The opportunity was taken away from them as their children. But they knew that they needed to strive to succeed for the future generation. They too were driven to succeed. Having heard all of these stories as a child, I knew that I needed to not let all of the sacrifice they went through go in vain. I needed to drive. I needed to succeed. And instead of going out partying like a rock star, my high schooling wasn't too great. I needed to avoid all of that, unfortunately. I knew that there were really two outcomes in my schooling, that either you'd be involved in gangs or you'd be involved in drugs. But the only third hidden option was to advance through your schooling as fast as possible, being that it was a charter school. So I opted for that route. And I graduated high school 2 years early. I took double credits in college. I was in college by 13, and by the time I was out of high school, I already had pretty much more credits than one even needs. And I already had my bachelor's degree under the legal drinking limit. And here I stand with you today, almost achieving my master's degree with a concentration in finance with one or two more classes to go. So I told all of you today to look around the room, to see all of these faces that we have here today. Who we are. What are we doing here? The reason why we're all here is because we all have the same spark. We are all here because we're driven to succeed. We're driven because we want to be the best that we could possibly be. And that's why we come to Toastmasters. We come to Toastmasters because we want to be competent communicators, we want to be competent leaders, we want to make that networking skills possible. And we'll do so by working very hard through our leadership and communicator manuals. It's no easy task. I've been through all the schooling in a very short time, and this is actually quite difficult. To all of our existing Toastmasters who have already completed their first couple speeches, especially Lakeisha. Great job yesterday. The tough part's already done. We don't have that physical barrier like my grandparents. We don't have the mental barrier like my grandparents. And we don't have the opportunity barriers like my parents. We have the opportunity. We're here today in Toastmasters. And this is a time to take that advantage, be grateful for the opportunities that we have at this very moment, and use this as propellant into the future to make for a life better for ourselves and even our children or next generation. To the new Toastmasters, welcome. You're about to embark on a really huge journey that only takes the very first step, that very first speech. And by the time you're done, you will feel the accomplishment of being driven to succeed, having that networking skills, having the communication skills, and having that leadership skills. In the end, we're all here for that one common goal. We're all here because we are driven to succeed. Toastmaster.